Alrighty. I emailed you guys the questions for the Fire Eaters book. It also reminds you which chapters to read and which ones to omit. And it gives you some advice on there too. That's one of those where you definitely want to read the intro and conclusion first. It's not, that's a book that gives people trouble. I don't think because it's difficult, I think it's because it's just so much information in it. But you're not trying to memorize the life story of every one of those guys. You're trying to get the main point. So it's basically a collective biography. Yeah, there's the other book too. I'll send you guys something in the next 2 or 3 days on that. That one's more like an abbreviated period textbook.
What is the other book?
American in the 1850s or something. It's the same all.
Shattering the Union.
Yeah, Shattering.
Shattering.
That's what it is. I was like American 1500.
Learning new stuff all the time.
It's out of left field.
I'll send you something on that one too. I had intended for you to read that whole book, but I don't think I will. I'm going to trim some of that. But with cutting the other one, and it'll still add up to really like one book once we get chapters cut. On the other one, I probably won't give you questions. I'll give you a list of key terms. It's more like a textbook. Just kind of walks you through the 50s. I like it. It's a good book. I think he spends way too much time on Kansas. It gets confusing, so we'll probably limit some of that. But the rest of it's really good book. Okay, let's see, last time we were here, we started this little brief section, or what I intended to be a brief section, kind of basically into the war, or during the Mexican War through the beginning of the 50s. I think we covered 2 or 3 things here. We reminded ourselves that slavery debates now are very much in that stage where it's a moral issue for both sides, therefore making it maybe not impossible, but certainly difficult to compromise. The question is, can slavery go to the Mexican concession, the lands gained from the Mexican War? Really, you have 3 options in theory for the extended 3630 line. It's not taken seriously by most people. That'll come up again today. Most people didn't take it seriously for reasons we've discussed. So instead, you had 3 options. What amounted to eventually kind of a northern view, southern view, and a compromise view. The Wilmot Proviso said no slavery. They proposed no slavery in the territories gained from the war at all. Then you have the Calhoun or Southern proposal, which effectively said that it should not only be allowed but guaranteed. Covered that in detail. And then popular sovereignty was the idea that you'd leave it up to the residents who moved in the territory. And we said that that was going to be problematic, as we'll see. Not this time, but probably next week sometime. It's just because it's too important to do a simple popular vote. People wouldn't go along with it. Then we did the presidential election of 1848, not one of your more famous elections, but interesting nonetheless, where you had the Whigs and the Democrats both dodging the issue just in their own ways. The Democrats by opting for popular sovereignty, just being very vague on how and when it would play out. The Whigs opting to basically, when in doubt, run a military guy and avoid the issue completely, which they did with Zachary Taylor. The Free Soil Party was kind of that weird alliance of all different kinds of folks who wanted slavery not to exist in the territories for various reasons. And in the results, Taylor won the election, but died in 1850, which opened the door for the Compromise of 1850 because his successor, Millard Fillmore, supported the Compromise. Okay, so what I'll cover today, I'd like to do 3 things if we have time. If not, we'll get 2 of them, but I think we can get all 3. The first one is a meaning that doesn't really pop up in most just kind of basic American history textbooks. It's not covered in most basic classes. It's not all that famous. But in Southern history, it's very famous, and it's very famous if you study, events leading to the war, that kind of thing. So it's called the Nashville Convention. It actually met twice, as we're going to see, but really one main meeting. Its origins, its actions, what we're looking at here, it's kind of a for dispute over exactly whose idea it was, but most people point to Calhoun. If Calhoun, it was either his idea or someone planted the seed and he was really on board with it, because he very much suggested that everybody go along with it. And so what they did is they called a meeting of Southern leaders to meet in Nashville, Tennessee, And the idea was to try to create unity among Southern leaders in opposition to the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, so keep in mind, the Compromise of 1850 is not yet passed. And even when it is passed, here in a minute, there is no Wilmot Proviso. Remember, the Proviso never passed, but it's a kind of an official statement of what would become a Northern view. So a bunch of Southerners are going to meet, representing 9 of the states. It's 176 delegates. It's pretty significant showing. So a bunch of Southern leaders from 9 states, they meet in Nashville. And again, the idea is to show unity in opposition to the Wilmot Proviso. There's a direct quotation in the announcement. It says the plan, or the hope, is they say to devise some mode of resistance to Northern aggression. Devise some mode of resistance to Northern aggression. As far as what actually happens at the meeting, not a hell of a lot, honestly, because what happens is the moderates end up kind of winning the day. By moderates in this context, I mean moderate by Southern standards. They're not moderate by national standards, but among the Southern leaders, among the guys who are starting to get pretty fired up here, the more moderate Southerners win the day. What I mean by that is that the more radical members were openly advocating secession. Of course, this is 11 years before secession, 10, 11 years before. A lot, but some of them, the more radical members, were openly advocating secession if something like the Wilmot Proviso were to pass. Or at least many of them were advocating at the very least the right of secession. Right. The moderates end up saying, nah, that's not really the goal. It's not what we're trying to do. Now, what the convention did announce is they announced that, in their opinion, we talked about this before, but now they put it on paper. They say all Americans in all the different states should have equal rights to the territories. Not supposed to be any restrictions on who can move to federally recognized territories. Supposed to have equal rights, and therefore the implication of the statement is Congress has no right to exclude anyone from the territories. In other words, they can't. Their argument is Congress cannot exclude slavery from the territories. They're going to have this argument for years. It's going to keep coming up. Eventually, the Supreme Court will get involved, but that's still 7 years down the road. At any rate, by their standards, the moderates went out. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Some of the members of the convention expressed a willingness to extend the 3630 line, or at least a willingness to talk about it. That's surprising. That's not a standard view, north or south, for reasons we've talked about, the whole moral thing, right? But some of the moderate delegates in the South at the Nashville Convention, they actually expressed a willingness to extend the line. That can be interpreted a couple different ways, I think. The fact that they were willing to discuss that. I've seen it interpreted a couple of different ways. One way is some people say, well, that suggests, they're ready to compromise, right, by extending that line. Maybe. If you think that's the case, and who knows, you could be right, but why would they do that? What's to be gained by it? I can think of one thing. Again, it's not most of them, but clearly a bunch of them were willing to extend the line. But what do you think is the reason for that?
Like extend it west?
Yeah, take the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise and stretch it all the way to the ocean. Remember, the only question here is, can slavery go to the Mexican cession? That's all we're talking about. The land they gained from the war.
Get more slaves. Slaves would be allowed in those territories.
South of the line, yeah. That's what I think.
The majority of it, right?
Maybe, yeah. Well, it'd be fairly equal. Might be a little bit more to the north, actually. I think, though, the only thing I can come up with as to why any of them on the southern side would be willing to go along with that is because it would at least guarantee them the territory south of the line. That's all I can think of. In other words, it's like it wouldn't be a huge victory, but it wouldn't be a total defeat either. That's really all I can think of. So it's interpreted that way sometimes, that they're willing to compromise. A second way it's interpreted when they said they'd extend the line is maybe that they're desperate. Because they can see something, and I don't know if you've thought about it like this, but the Wilmot Proviso is different from things we've talked about in the past. Because it's not drawing a line or something like that. I think a lot of them are worried, them being some of the Southern leaders, I think they're worried a little bit because if the Wilmot Proviso were to pass, then you've reached a new stage, meaning this is no longer just North against South. This is now the federal government is in the business of legislating against slavery on moral grounds. That's new, that's different. We haven't seen that before. Because everybody understands by this stage in American history, everyone understands why the people who support the proviso support it. It's for moral reasons. And so if it were to pass, then that means, whether you like it or not, and whichever side you're on, the federal government has inserted itself into a moral question and has voted a certain way. So it's one of those two things. Are they ready to compromise because at least they can guarantee it's south of the line, or are they a little bit desperate in realizing they're not just squaring off against the Northerners, they're squaring off against the federal government? Either of those could be true, maybe both are true. Right? What they ended up doing though is they announced all that and then they adjourned, and their plan was, okay, we'll adjourn the meeting, but we'll come back together after Congress has acted. Okay, so remember all that stuff we talked about last time, that's all floating out there, Congress is talking about it, this takes a couple of years. Right, so there is no compromise yet, but everyone knows the terms that are being proposed. Right. Okay, we're going to see what Congress did in a minute. But once Congress acts, right, they hold a second meeting. This time it's much smaller. They didn't all bother to show up this time. It's much smaller. They meet again in Nashville. This time the membership is much more radical. And the second Nashville meeting, they rejected the Compromise of 1850, and they affirmed the right of secession. Now that doesn't mean they're beating the drum saying, okay, all states should secede right now. That's not the same thing. But they're affirming their right to secede, their right to separate from the Union. Again, it's a smaller meeting. There aren't as many guys there. Well, for reasons we're about to see, the compromise is passed. So it's in terms of the law, it's a dead letter. The issue's over. You can debate the theory and abstract all you want to, but the settlement has been reached.
Yeah. What did you say they rejected?
Well, they rejected the Compromise of 1850.
And it was, sorry.
And then they reaffirmed the right to secede. All of that kind of is reflective of what I didn't know how to put this, so I just kind of put a generic phrase up there. Compromise sentiment around the South. I think the fact that the compromise passed, as we'll see in a minute, both sides kind of get some things out of it. I think that shows that, the moderates have won, the radicals are there, but they're far fewer. There's compromise sentiment around the country. I think people just want the problem to go away. North and South battled about Missouri, they battled about nullification, now they're battling about the next concession. It wears you down over time. And a compromise has been passed. It has support North and South, not unanimous. No compromise is ever unanimous. By definition, it can't be unanimous. But I think that's what's going on there. The compromise sentiment kind of calms everything down. Now, that doesn't mean, that this meeting was meaningless. So let's look at what it actually did, the effects of the convention. It's not meaningless. So, I think the lesson the Southerners learned in this will come up a little bit in the readings too. I think they realized just how important a united effort was going to have to be. Right? they understand they're outnumbered by the Northerners. And by the way, the population gap is only growing. It's not getting smaller, it's only growing. So they know they're outnumbered. To be able to get their way at the federal level, competing against Northerners is tough enough as it is, just mathematically. The last thing they can afford to do is be divided. And so this taught them a lesson, that they're going to have to be united. And I think the fire eaters, or they're just now being called the fire eaters by the early 50s, but I think they had to learn that at least at this stage, the moderates are dominant in the South. Which, by the way, makes sense, right? Moderates are dominant. If the radicals are dominant, they're not radical. Right? They're the orthodox, they're the standard position, right? You couldn't call them radical. So the effect did, the conference did have some effects. And that's what I think is probably the best way to put it. It opens their eyes that the South is not as radicalized as the hardcore guys would like. Not yet. Okay. So finally, why did the South accept the Compromise of 1850? I know this is weird, we haven't covered the Compromise yet, but I'm about to. But all this happened before the Compromise. Why did the South accept it? As I was alluding to, I think they're tired. I think they're tired of the conflict. They're tired of arguing about it. A settlement has been reached. By the way, the settlement includes popular sovereignty, as we're about to see. So, they theoretically could still win the day. Also, a lot of people who study this point to, even though North and South are so different, they're still the same country, same people, nationality, mostly the same race, same language, same historical traditions, with one giant exception, right? And then the economic systems of the two are complementary. Cotton producing South, slowly industrializing North, they complement each other. And so, it makes sense that they accept it. I don't think there's anything radical or mind-blowing about Southerners accepting the compromise. I think it's fairly predictable. What's interesting, though, is, as we're about to see, not everybody thought it was a great idea. Calhoun was not happy. Now, technically, he died before the compromise was passed, but he knew what was going to be in it. And Calhoun said, "This is just awful." I think Calhoun looks at it the same way Jefferson, as an old man, looked at the Missouri Compromise. She says, "This is a temporary fix. It's a Band-Aid. It's not a good idea. You're not just recognizing the differences between the two sections. We've long known the differences. You're now legislating it. You're putting it on the record. You're in effect drawing a line between the two sides." In fact, Calhoun's famous, as he was dying, he allegedly said, "The South, the poor South." I think he understood they're going to lose this thing. Right. Okay, that's kind of a weird, twisted story there, and I know it. Anyway, any questions on that one? It's not a story you get much, I'll grant you that one. Nashville Convention. Okay, now, while that's going on, you have the actual Compromise of 1850 conversation. I'm going to do the nuts and bolts of this. It'll come up in both of your books. You had it in freshman history. So you do have to know it. The Compromise of 1850 is very important, but it's pretty straightforward. And basically all we're going to do here, I'm going to walk you through the 5 things that Congress was arguing about for this 2-year period, 48 to 50. Heck, theoretically 46 to 50, depending on how you look at it. And then we'll come down here and we'll do the compromise. The compromise is just Congress answering the 5 questions. All right, so let's summarize the 5 questions, and then we'll see how they answered it, and we'll look at why it matters and how people reacted to it. So we'll go a little bit into depth down there on the bottom. So, all right, during and in the aftermath of the Mexican War, what are we fighting about here in this country? Well, the first one is obvious. We opened this whole section with it, and that's slavery in the territories, more specifically, the Mexican cession. Can slavery go there?
But keep in mind, at this stage of things, it's not just yes or no. It's not just canon. It's who gets to decide. Is how do you know? We don't know. So can slavery go to the Mexican concession? And then who gets to decide? How do we know? What's the plan? Keep bearing in mind you have three different proposals going on. Second, but directly related question is California. Now that sounds kind of weird because obviously California is part of the Mexican concession, so why is it separate? The way Congress approached this, the reason California is seen as separate is because even though it's part of the Mexican concession, it already has enough people to be a state. And so, you know, whatever answer you come up with for the rest of the Mexican concession may or may not be suitable for California. Because what if you decide on popular sovereignty? Well, that pushes the question down the line. So you can't just, even if you were toying with the idea of drawing the line, that won't work either because the line would divide California, right? It would be on both sides of the line. So California is big enough, it has enough people, it's already, it's ready to skip territorial status and be a state. We have to answer the question right now. It cannot be, you can't kick the can down the road like they're going to do with the Mexican concession. You probably know this. I think we touched on it in the second unit. Why is the California population so big already? I mean, part of it's migration, West Coast port, Spanish, Mexican, some Americans moving there. But why'd the population explode?
Gold rush.
Yeah, California gold rush, right? Late 1840s. A lot of people think the California gold rush represents maybe the largest single mass migration in American history. I mean, internal migration, right? Yeah. Okay, good stuff. So California's a separate question. Third, slave trade in Washington, D.C. Here's an interesting one. I don't think this will surprise you. Now, on this one, we're not talking about slavery per se. We're not talking about slavery. Slavery is legal in D.C. We're talking about the buying and selling of slaves, the actual trade, slave trade, buying and selling. It is legal, of course, in D.C. Washington, D.C., as you know, sits on the Potomac River. It's between Maryland and Virginia. Maryland and Virginia are southern states. Those are slave states. I say it all the time. I know you and I don't, in our lifetime, we don't really equate Maryland as southern, but historically, traditionally, and culturally, it was southern. And Virginia is very southern. Think of all the guys who are from Virginia, right? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Marshall, Edmund Randolph, on and on and on and on, right? So, George Mason, Virginia. Okay. So, why has this become an issue? Here's why it becomes an issue. It's kind of interesting. The slave trade issue in D.C. comes up because basically a lot of Americans decided that it was a bad look, right? Including a lot of people who were not activists, really not super politically active, not the kind of people who were always out crusading and trying to save the world. Yes, those people are involved too. But regular folks, you know, as far as we can tell, including regular people who really were not all bent out of shape about slavery. They just understood, you know, when people from around the country come to the United States, one of the places they go is the nation's capital. You could see humans being bought and sold in the street. Not a great look. Not really the look you want. In fact, we know from the records that the block that now holds the Supreme Court building, that had a slave auction house on it. So this one isn't so much about politics. It's not really, at least predominantly, a North-South issue. Let's see, the fugitive slave law might be the most controversial, or maybe other than the territories. The fugitive slave law might be the most controversial. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because it comes up in your readings kind of a lot, especially in the 1850s book. So basically, the nuts and bolts here, and this will help you. If you know this part, then your reading will go faster. Basically, the idea is it's not a proposal to create a fugitive slave law, that already existed. It's a proposal to make it stronger. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is it's technically already, it is illegal at the time to assist a runaway slave. That is against the law. If you help them escape, that's illegal. If you hide them, illegal. If you don't turn them in, illegal. Right? Wasn't really being strictly enforced in a lot of places. So what's happening here is that there's not some push to create the law. It already exists. The push is among some prominent Southern members of Congress. They want it strengthened. They want to put some teeth into the law. And they're going to get their way. Now this is very controversial. It's probably the most emotional part because, and this was what we were talking about the other day, one of you brought it up and you were right, and you'll see this in your book. This is a great example of how you don't always assume. Most of the time, especially 19th century, we think of Southerners being the ones who insist upon states' rights and Northerners wanting the super powerful federal oversight and everything, and that's usually true, but not always. In this case, it's already against the law to assist an escaped slave, and Southern members of Congress are demanding federal enforcement of that law. Whereas Northerners are demanding states' rights not to go along with it, and states' rights to pass what they call personal liberty laws. Right? So it's they're kind of flipping the script here. It's Southerners demanding federal oversight for once. Listen, it's, how do you put this? It's not just symbolic, it's very real. And the law will be enforced in some areas. And you'll see a couple of famous cases. There's one all the way up in Boston where individuals try to enforce the law and try to recapture a guy, and a bunch of people in the city riot and protect him. So it's very real. It's not in the sense of huge numbers. There aren't that many runaway slaves. It's not a numbers thing. It's not a money thing. At the time of the war, the beginning of the war in 1861, there were 4 million slaves in the whole country. That's the 15 states where it was still legal. There were 4 million. So there weren't millions of escaped slaves. That's literally physically impossible. But there were some. The point is the fugitive slave law and the demand for a stronger law wasn't about numbers or money. It was about the principle. It was about the point. And some of the Southern senators wanted it enforced. Right? And then the last one is kind of the generic, most boring of all of them. The question is, how big is Texas? Where does Texas stop and New Mexico begin? Now, not Mexico. We already settled the boundary between Texas and Mexico. This is Texas and what would become New Mexico. All right. Because remember, let's see if we have the map here. Yeah, remember that's the original Texas, right? All that blue. So that takes up, gosh, more than half of present-day New Mexico. Well, here's the question. Why does it matter? I mean, it matters because you got to have borders or whatever, but during this...
Texas is a slave state, so you got to know where Texas is, slaves can go there.
Right, so Texas is a slave state. Conversation's over. New Mexico may or may not be. We don't know yet. So the farther west Texas goes, then the farther west slavery absolutely is legal, no question. But if you peel back Texas and you expand New Mexico, well, we don't know. So that's why it's a big deal. Okay, questions on the questions? This won't surprise you. You have a conflict, need a compromise, you call Henry Clinton. Right? So there he is, they dug him up. I've always thought, I used to make this joke, and nobody ever got the damn joke, so I quit making it. I thought he looked like, this is what I imagined Miss Havisham to look like. Charles Dickens' Great Expectation. Fair enough. Note to self. Nope. Just leave the joke. No Charles Dickens fans. All right, I got a couple of nods. All right. Books are your friends, people. Read. Or at least watch the movies. There you go. Do that. Same thing. Take you like 9 years to read a Charles Dickens book anyway. I have to admit, I've given up more than once. You read one of these Dickens books and you're like 400 pages in, you're like, oh my God, there's another 500 pages. It's like, I'm sure it worked out well for them. You know? That's another skill I've developed as I've gotten older. I now have the ability to give up on a movie if it's terrible. I never used to do that. I'd sit through it.
Sadly, I think you do that a lot nowadays.
I don't know, man. Well, I don't go to the movies though. I don't like humans, so I don't go to the movies. And I don't want to pay that much. But even just on TV, it used to be if it was terrible, I still got to watch it, just on principle. But now, if it's bad, I turn. I know you all were wondering about that, but now you know. All right.
Kept me awake at night.
Huh?
Kept me awake at night.
There you go. All right, good. All right, Compromise of 1850. Let's look at the terms. All we're about to do is answer. First, slavery in the territories. Okay, here's what they decide. This is a little bit long-winded. I'll say it a couple times. So here's the thing. What are you going to do with slavery in the territories? Here's the thing. Now, first, this is excluding California. This is the Mexican concession, not including California. What they decided is they would take the rest of that area and they would divide it into 2 territories. They're going to call one of them Utah and the other one New Mexico. Take the Mexican concession, excluding California, divide it in 2, create 2 territories. One of them's Utah, one of them's New Mexico. And on the question of slavery, they would use popular sovereignty in both. They would use popular sovereignty in both. So California's a different deal. Cut the Mexican concession in 2. One of them's Utah, one of them's New Mexico. Use popular sovereignty with both. Reason you can get away with using popular sovereignty in the Mexican concession, there just really aren't very many people there. It's just not that big a deal at this point. There aren't that many people in New Mexico. There aren't that many in Utah. There's some. This is literally within a couple of years of the Mormon migration. So there are some, but it's not heavily populated. Because I said the other day, popular sovereignty won't work. Well, it won't work when they apply it, as we'll see next week. When they apply it in an area with a booming, growing population, it won't work. But they did away with it with the Mexican concession. All right, so that's the first one. Second question, California. This one turned out to be relatively easy. California was admitted as a free state. Free state, no slavery, no questions asked. Pretty fairly simple. No doubt. Slave trade in Washington, D.C. On this one, they did agree to abolish the slave trade. They agreed to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C.
Was that unanimous or was it?
Nothing's unanimous.
Is it?
I think that's probably the least controversial of all of them. You know, you'll see this in one of your readings, probably Walther's book, the 1850s book. Well, Walther wrote both of your last 2 books, but the 1850 book. This is what they used to call an omnibus bill. They still say that very much in government now. Yeah, it's one of these annoying things Congress does. They're talking about 9,000 different things. They put them all in one huge bill and they cram it through, knowing nobody's ever going to read the whole thing. You know, they still do that kind of thing now, and it's not cool. It's not good at all. That's why every once in a while you hear some controversy and you'll say, "Oh, that guy over there in that party voted against that bill. Why would he do that? His party wants that main point."
There's other things in the bill that they don't.
Yeah, there are 12 other things. But as a people, our attention span is so short now, we don't want to hear that. We won't listen to the guy say, "Well, I wanted that one thing, but they put these other 12 things in here, and you don't see it till you get to page 412." Right? So here, this is a great example of that. Okay, anyway, yeah, that one was fairly easy, I think. Okay, here's your controversy: fugitive slave law. This is where it gets a little sticky. Okay, so as I said, there's already a fugitive slave law in place. The Southerners wanted it stronger. What they were able to do, this is, I guess, where you say where the Southerners get their way. The law is made stronger. It's made stronger in a couple of ways. A few ways. One is there are federal agents who will be put on the job to enforce this. There are federal agents to enforce it. It also says that local law enforcement can be fined and or arrested for not enforcing it. Okay, so it's already a law, but they make it stronger, they give it some teeth. How do they give it teeth? They make it essentially federal jurisdiction or federal enforcement. They have federal marshals to enforce it, and they will arrest local sheriffs, they will fine local sheriffs if they find out you are also not enforcing it. Again, this is what leads to that huge controversy where Southerners want federal powers, Northerners want state rights. And this is what you'll run into in your book when you see that phrase, personal liberty laws. The Northerners' take was, hey, once you cross into our state, they're free. And we don't want Southern slave catchers, we don't want Southern law enforcement, and we don't even want federal agents coming into our state and recapturing some, right? All right. And then finally, the good old Texas-New Mexico border. I guess the easy way to put this is the Compromise of 1850 is where you get the present-day shape of Texas. So it's made smaller, right? All that massive area, that was parts of New Mexico and Colorado and Oklahoma and all of that is taken away. Texas, of course, is still huge, but it is made smaller. This is what gives you the famous Texas Panhandle. Compromise of 1850 does that. As far as why did they get that shape, there are some moving parts there. They cut it down below the Oklahoma Panhandle because that, although it isn't official, that puts it below the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise, which doesn't legally apply, but it's symbolic. And then the rest of it is just a compromise between the two sides, just to roll back the sides of Texas. Texas got some stuff out of the deal too. The federal government took on some debts that Texas owed. So, I guess you could argue that part's a minor victory for the anti-slavery side. Right.
Question.
Significance. Yeah, here's where people get carried away sometimes. I'm going to tell you the one thing I know, and then I'll tell you the two theories people throw out there. The one thing we know with regard to the significance of the compromise is this. It shows that the American people are not ready to go to war over any of this. Kind of like what we're saying with the Nashville Convention. You have your radicals, you have your hardcore Southern types, but they didn't even dominate their own convention. Right? So again, I know that sounds silly, but the significance of the compromise is that they compromised. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I don't think it is. I think, well, I always phrase it this way: they compromised in 1850, but 11 years later, they fight the deadliest war in American history. So the fact that they're willing to compromise at 50 is meaningful, right? Now, there are two other things you'll hear, and you may see in your books. This may come up. Two other theoretical things that where people will say the compromise is significant. One is they say, well, the gap in resources between North and South in 1861 is greater than it was in 1850. So what? What's the point of that?
So if the South were to secede earlier, it would be easier for them to secede.
Yeah, theoretically, the gap in industrialization, technology, weaponry, mass production, etc., is not as great as it was 11 years later. You don't get carried away with the what-if stuff, but it is true. Had they gone to war in 1850, the two sides are considerably closer in resources than they were 11 years later. Okay. The other thing people point to, this is a little more meaningful. I can go along with this one a little bit more. The compromise gave the country's leadership time to work out their differences. They're intersectional differences, north and south. The compromise gave the country's leadership time to work out their differences with something other than war. They failed. They failed to do that, rather obviously, but that's an interesting point. You know, we talked about something like this last unit with Polk. We talked about how people have kind of reevaluated how they look at things. Polk used to be seen as this great president, and now a lot of people don't see him that way. Nothing, he didn't change, his achievements didn't change, we changed in how we evaluate the achievements. Well, people used to say this one that I'm telling you here about the Compromise of 1850, about, well, it gave them a chance, et cetera, as like that was a good thing, and a lot of people still do. A lot of historians don't like that now, though, because what's the implication? What's the other side to compromise?
There's no war that ends slavery.
Exactly. So it's like, it's one of those subtle things you look for. So I know a lot of you guys are going to end up teaching history. You have to watch this when you assign books. And it's not a value judgment, it's just you have to notice these things. Look at word choice. Things like, in some older books, Henry Clay gets credit for the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. In a lot of newer books, he gets the blame for the two compromises. Okay, whatever. I think what you have, it's fine, it's not the end of the world. I think what you have there, though, is an example of presentism. I think that's people in 2024 projecting 200 years ago and thinking, well, they should have handled it my way. Okay. Well, they didn't, and they weren't gonna, so I don't really have a lot of patience for those kinds of conversations. Anyway, you should be aware that there are those who say that's one of the reasons it's significant. Right? Let's look at how people reacted to the compromise. I don't think any of this will surprise you. Big picture, nobody's thrilled with it. Which makes sense, right? It's a compromise. Right? It's a compromise, which means no one entirely gets their way. That's kind of part of the definition of compromise, right? Nobody's thrilled with it, but let's look more specifically. The radical Southerners, the ones who met in Nashville, the ones who are becoming known as the fire eaters, they're not happy at all with the compromise of 1850. And again, this goes back to what we talked about last time, is they see this as the federal government is getting too involved. The federal government is, it's not as bad to them as it would have been had the proviso passed, but it is still the government getting involved. They don't like that. So they're not happy at all. Northerners who were either genuinely anti-slavery, or the radical, the abolitionists who we talked about, not the same thing as we talked about abolitionists and anti-slavery, not the same thing. Those kinds of people are not happy at all. And we kind of just alluded to that. With, do you say credit for the compromise or blame for the compromise? They're not happy. But what do you think the average person thought? We just talked about the radical Southerners, we just talked about the radical abolitionists, and the larger number of people who were anti-slavery to one degree or another. What do you think the average American thought?
Okay, it's just over now. Good.
Exactly, as far as we can tell. The average Americans thought, look, you've been arguing about this for 4 years. Good, done, shut up, let's move on. And you see that sometimes in American history. Right? If you've had more modern history classes with some of the classes Dr. Barton taught, Bean probably teaches some of this. Like after World War I, a lot of Americans were done with crusades, done trying to save people. Stop trying to save this, stop trying to save that. Business as usual, right? Go back to business as usual. In fact, what was it? Wasn't it Warren Harding, who I guess his lack of vocabulary caused him to create a new word? He said return to normalcy.
Dr. talks about that.
Oh, does he?
Class.
Yeah.
Every class.
Yeah, normalcy's not a word. It is now. The word he was looking for was normality, but fair enough. Now we have normalcy. That's how you put your stamp on history. You just make up a word.
And it gets added to the dictionary.
There you go. Hey, man, if enough people say it, it's like I've told you. I mean, now if you look it up, you know, we talked about this with Jackson. If you look it up now, people think disenfranchised is a word. It's not a word. It is now. Enfranchised is a word. Disfranchised is a word. Disenfranchised is not a word.
Disenfranchised, doesn't that kind of like contradict this?
Yeah. And by the way, let's talk about how to use an apostrophe. While we're on, no, all right. That does really eat away at me though when people don't use apostrophes correctly. Doesn't that just bother you? No.
No.
I feel like if it doesn't bother you, it's because you don't know how to use one.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
We were the only ones seeing it.
Any questions on that? This is nuts and bolts stuff. Some of you've had this from me in like 3 classes, so you probably know pretty well by now. Okay. Honestly, though, the reason to go ahead and do it like this, though, is once you have these basics down, when you read it in the book, it'll. So this is what it looks like then, post Compromise of 1850, right? Green is free, either states or territories, at least for now. That part in the middle is going to change next week, or maybe Thursday, depending on how quick we go. The part in the blue, of course, is open to slavery, and the orange is
How would the territories eventually vote Utah, New Mexico?
in favor of slavery. But there's so few people. Like you're talking, the last I saw, there's like maybe a few hundred slaves total. And almost certainly those are just owned by people who were temporarily there. Okay, one more thing for today. Let's do another election that nobody ever talks about. Maybe with good reason, but we are studying this period closely, so let's look at it. Yeah, you have a sequence of elections that aren't really very famous, right? 40 was famous, you know, Log Cabin. 44 was famous, James K. Cole, Manifest Destiny. 48, 52, and 56 are not famous, but I like to cover all of them, especially 56. We'll go ahead and cover 52 because you can start to see the battle lines being drawn. I think that's a good reason to look at. Okay, what we're about to see, the Whigs against the Democrats, we're about to see, and I know this won't surprise you, they're still, in their own ways, kind of ducking the issue, although they're a little more, the Democrats at least say a little something. At least by policy, not slavery, but by policy. Okay, let's start with the Whigs. By the way, just as a side note, we had the Free Soil Party in the previous election. The Free Soilers did run this time, but they don't really make a meaningful dent this time because the compromise kind of wiped them out. They were a one-party issue. What are you going to campaign on? It's already been solved, right? So it's really the Whigs against Democrats. Okay, so the problem for the Whigs in this election is that they're really divided. They're really divided going into the election. And here's where your north-south thing starts to come up even within their party. A bunch of the northern Whigs who, to one degree or another, were anti-slavery. They didn't like the Compromise of 1850, and they saw it as kind of a surrender, kind of a capitulation on resisting the expansion of slavery, right? They didn't want to see slavery spread. Now again, that doesn't mean they're abolitionists, they're not great moral crusaders or something, but they don't want to see slavery spread. In other words, these would have been hardline Wilmot Proviso types, right?
Are you talking about the Whigs in general or specifically?
Northern Whigs. Northern Whigs, yeah. They would have wanted to see their party support the Wilmot Proviso. That didn't happen, at least not officially. Well, what's that have to do with anything? What it has to do with anything is it means they wouldn't support the incumbent. Well, the incumbent, of course, is Millard Fillmore. Because remember, Taylor died, Fillmore took his place. Fillmore, the Whig,
was very instrumental in getting the compromise passed. So a lot of the Northern Whigs say, well, we're not going to support this guy. We're not going to vote for him. And so at the convention, he didn't get the nomination. The Whigs struggled to get a candidate. They went round and round and round in their convention. Many votes trying to pick a guy. They end up settling on the guy in the top picture there, General Winfield Scott. Not surprising, right? It's the Whigs, when in doubt, right? Run a military guy. They did it in 1840 with Harrison. They did it in 48 with Taylor. Now they're doing it in 1852 with Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott, by the way, was the other main general for the American forces in the Mexican War. There were two main forces that the U.S. used in Mexico. Zachary Taylor led the one in northern Mexico. Winfield Scott led the one that captured Mexico City. Scott is a long-time military officer, very highly respected in the military, sort of a surprise candidate, but a long-time, highly respected officer. Not only did he serve in the Mexican War, this guy served in the War of 1812. And by the way, would still be on staff when the Civil War started. So, yeah, he's going to be around. Here's the thing about Scott. Interesting candidate. One of the reasons I like to cover this election is the way the two sides pick their candidates. You can see some lessons here. So Winfield Scott is kind of a compromise candidate. So he's a military hero. He's not a career politician. We've seen in this class that can help, right? He's from Virginia, so he's a Southern. But he's not a slave owner. Now, I've read nothing that suggests he's some kind of big activist, but he does appear to have been openly anti-slavery. Not an abolitionist. I've read nothing that says he was a radical, but he seems to have been fairly openly anti-slavery, or at least anti-slavery expansion. So if you think about it, if you're a Northern Whig, you say, well, maybe I support this guy, you know, he is in our party. I don't like that he's a Southerner, but he's not a slave owner. He's popular. Okay, you know, that's a compromise. The problem for the Whigs is that the Southern Whigs don't want him. They don't trust him. They say, you're Southern, but not the right kind of Southern. They just don't trust him. And so a bunch of Southern Whigs bailed. And they end up supporting the Democrats. So, on the Whig side, again, when in doubt, get yourself a military man, duck and dodge the slavery issue, and get a compromise candidate, right? Democrats went a completely different route. What they had going for them, the Democrats, what they had going for them is that they were much more united. They were not divided like the Whigs. And it seems, the more you read about the election, it seems that the Democrats made a conscious decision to kind of take advantage of the division within the Whigs. You know, they could see that their opponents were divided. And so the Democrats said, well, listen, even if we don't all agree, us Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, let's get on the same page. Because that way when the voters go to the polls, you don't know what the heck the Whigs are endorsing. The Democrats said, let's take a stand on something, let's make it clear here's who we are. So the Democrats said, we will endorse the Compromise of 1850. It's passed, it's the law, we're moving forward, we support the compromise. Also, the Democrats were very careful, even though many of them agreed with Calhoun, they were careful not to officially endorse his, the Calhoun doctrine. That is to say, the Democrats did not demand the spread of slavery to the territories.
Many of them wanted it, yes, but that's not in the platform. You don't campaign on that. So they didn't demand slavery in the territories. They didn't follow Calhoun's lead. They just said, hey, let's move the country forward. We've been fighting about this. We got to compromise. Our members, North and South, are on the same page here, right? For a candidate, here's another great lesson in politics. They nominated the guy in the bottom picture there, Franklin Pierce. He's from New Hampshire. Pierce is an interesting candidate. Again, kind of came out of nowhere. He appealed to Northerners and Southerners. Not because of slavery. I don't know how you could appeal to both on slavery. But he appealed to both because he was very aggressive in his rhetoric with regard to expansion and foreign policy. Pierce is very aggressive. Southerners like that. They could look past this whole New Hampshire thing. They could look past the fact that he's from New England because he was aggressive in his words about expansion and foreign policy. As you'll see, I don't remember if I talked about it in class. Maybe we will if we have time. If not, we'll cover it in the readings. There's a push among some Southerners. They want Cuba as another slave state, and they're not kidding. Now, it's not a widespread movement, but the ones who are doing it are very serious. And so they like his aggressive rhetoric. The other thing is, he was seen as, kind of younger, youthful, energetic. He had served in the Mexican War, so he's kind of a compromise candidate, kind of a guy you could package and sell to the voters, right? He's also kind of weird. He was friends with a bunch of Northeastern intellectual types, poets and authors and transcendentalists. On the surface, he's an odd choice, but I guess it makes sense as a compromise guy. Here we go, the results, the big picture, kind of where does this take us, where do we stand? Well, Pierce won. I think you knew that. We never had President Scott. I think you knew that. Pierce wins the election. I would suggest it's probably pretty predictable that Pierce won. Not because there's anything great about Franklin Pierce. There's not, as you'll see especially when you read the 1850s book. He's terrible. This is not going to go well for him at all. The chapter in the book about him is pretty good. But I think it's predictable because the Whigs are divided. The Whigs don't really have anything to run on. In fact, this is the last. It's not literally, officially the last time the Whigs are in a presidential election, but it's the last time they're one of the two main parties. They're basically about to die. The electoral vote, Pierce won it 254 to 42. You can't win by much more than that, right? I mean, we all know some people are going to vote their party no matter what, right? So for him to win by that much is significant. But the thing is, the question is looming. This issue is dividing the American people. Slavery expansion issues dividing the American people. And I think probably more important, of course, is dividing people. It has for years. I think the more important point is this. More and more Americans on both sides, this is something we're going to see maybe next time, if not next week. More and more Americans on both sides are losing patience with the two parties. Because I mentioned this last time, we'll mention it again whenever we get to 56. Of all the presidential elections this country has seen, all the elections you and I have talked about in here, never once has either of the two major parties taken an official stance on slavery. Never. That sounds crazy, but it's never happened up to this point. And a lot of people are starting to lose patience with it. There are some Northerners, like the people who are defecting from the Whig Party, they're about to make their own party, as we'll see later. And a lot of Southerners are getting a lot more hardcore. In fact, as we're going to see, the fire eaters, not the majority by any means, but they are the leadership. these are the guys who start out, the fire eaters, they love Calhoun, they look up to him, he's their hero. But eventually, of course he died at 50, but eventually what happens is they lose patience with his ideology, and they become much more radical. Right. By the way, I didn't mention it under the wigs. You can go back and put it in if you want to, but it's probably worth mentioning. In this election year, that's the year Henry Clay really did die. All my jokes aside, he really did die in 52. And so that kind of robbed the Whigs of his steadying presence. Right? Questions so far? A couple of quick comments on the books. As I said, you have the study guide for the fire eaters book. It's a big book. It's a hard book for a lot of people. You don't have to read the whole thing. I think I cut probably half of it. Just read the part you're supposed to read the intro and conclusion first, have the study questions with you when you read it. It won't be nearly as bad that way. Don't try to worry about every detail of these guys' lives. That's not what it's for. You're looking for what they have in common and how they see things differently. What are they trying to accomplish? That's right. I will send you something on the other book. I'll probably trim that down a little bit. Probably won't send you questions. I might send you a list of key terms for each chapter or something like that. The guy who wrote both of those books, you guys must be a curse or something, because the authors of all of these books are now dead. Rimini died, Campbell died just a while back, and Walther died just a while back. So maybe I'm gonna. Maybe it's me for assigning the books.
Assign another book and see what happens.
Maybe not.
Make sure he's alive, right? Make it somebody you don't like.
Or somebody whose job I want.
There you go.
Give us a David Irving book.
Who's the Civil War historian in Ole Miss now? Actually, I know that guy too, and he's old too, so maybe I'll assign his book. Actually, Walther, I tell people this story sometime. This is to show you we all make fools of ourselves sometimes. When I was a young pup, trying to be a brand new baby professor, Eric Walther, the guy who wrote those books, interviewed me. I tried to get a job at the University of Houston. I didn't get it. I'm glad though I won't be at the University of Houston. But I was young and unemployed, so I would take it. Anyway, he interviews me, and he's a big name in the field. I mean, Walther, well, he's not now, he's dead, but he was a big name. And so he's talking to me, and he's like, hey, I hope this works out for you. He's like, look, if you don't get the job, you could do this and this and this. And he was talking about go be a visiting faculty at A&M, which I did. He said, you can do that. A lot of people did it. He said, and he starts naming all these Civil War historians who got their start as a visiting professor at A&M. And he mentions this guy named Brooks Simpson, who's really good. He's at Arizona State. And I said, the way he said it was, he said, I started there, Brooks Simpson started there, and I said, man, Brooks Simpson's really good. And he goes, I'm pretty good.
Is that why you didn't get the job, you think?
No. It's a big school, and I was young. They weren't hiring me. But it didn't help. So, job interview advice 101 from Clampitt. Don't insult the person interviewing you.
You just said, yeah, Brooks Simpson, he's just as good as you are.
I should have.
Not as good as
Or you should have been
Yeah,
like, but you're great. You're way better. You didn't like Simpson, you're way better than Brooks Simpson.
I used to see Walter at conferences, and he was a super nice guy, really nice guy. But let's just say, you do your sessions during the day where people stand in there read boring papers, and you could just email me this. But then they have the book exhibit where all the presses are there, and you can get super cheap books, and you can network with people, and then they have parties in the hotel. That guy, I'm speaking ill of the dead here, but by 6 p.m. he was toasted. I'm talking about way past drunk. And he would just tell you, some people overshare when they get drunk. That's the way Eric was. Great guy, hard to go, but I know a lot about him, and I didn't need to. So, all right, I've got to go give a test. So what the hell, let's be done with it today. All right.